In this video, we're going to be looking at communication skills. So exactly what is communication? At its essence, it is the process of sharing and exchanging information. And there are basically three ways in which we communicate: via words, via tone of voice, and via non-verbal body language. So the first one, words, that is pretty obvious. If we're speaking the same language, I would ask a person, for example, where are you going? And the person would acknowledge my sentence and understand it. If we're both speaking and understanding English, that person would understand that I'm asking them a question in terms of where are they heading. Secondly, tone of voice. And this can also exchange a lot of information. So let's give you an example. If I were to ask you, so where are you going? The person would receive my words as I'm asking them where they are going in a very friendly and non-threatening manner. But if I were to tell you, where are you going? The person that receives that words would understand that I'm irritated or angry with them and I want to know where they are going. So you can see that tone of voice sometimes plays a big role in how we communicate. And then lastly, non-verbal or body language is also pretty obvious. Sometimes we communicate by eye contact, facial expression, and body gestures. So for example, flirting is a very good example of non-verbal body language. And most of you should be familiar with flirting, or I hope so at least. So if you're looking at a girl or you're looking at a boy across the room, in the classroom or in the club or wherever, and you're making eye contact and you're making facial gestures or body gestures, that is a non-verbal way of communication. So let's quickly look at the roadmap to success. In other words, the roadmap to good communication. So first of all, as we said, when we communicate, we speak with our words, our tone of voice, and also with our non-verbal body language. Now, in order to be heard, or in order for the receiver to hear what we are saying, it's important that we want that person to understand what we are saying. But sometimes things can get in the way. So it's very important to speak clearly and to the point so that you can engage with the person in terms of him or her understanding what you are saying. So let me quickly give you an example. Have you ever had the experience of somebody telling you or asking you something, but telling you a long story and not getting to the point, and your mind starts to wander off? And at the end of the day, you're not hearing what that person is asking you. Or have you ever had the experiencing of telling somebody something that just can't understand you? So what happens when communication fails? Well, it usually leads to misunderstanding and sometimes leads to animosity between parties. It's usually that case where you are heard, but you are not listened to. In other words, to put it a different way, you are hearing the person, but you're not listening to the person. And this is usually when people don't communicate effectively, or when there is sometimes distractions in the communication process. So let's use a very practical example. You are all students, and so you've all been attending classes, or you should have been attending classes. Sometimes when you're sitting in a class and the lecture is becoming boring and you're not paying attention, your mind tends to wander off and you're not listening to what the lecturer are telling you. So you're missing out on information. Sometimes, for example, we simply misunderstand the other person because that person isn't conveying their message properly. As you can see in this picture, the one person views the figure as a 6 and the other person views it as a 9. They should communicate in order to get a communal understanding of one another. So you can see that there are many ways in which communication can go wrong. And as I said, it can lead to misunderstanding and animosity between people. So how do we overcome communication failure? Or how do we engage in good communication? And this is basically two things that we have to do. We have to listen actively and we have to respond accordingly. So when we're listening actively, we're trying to understand the person's point of view. We're trying to understand their experience, and we're also trying to understand the emotion they're trying to convey. So for example, somebody that's trying to convince you of their political views, that would be their point of view that they're trying to express. And it would be important to be open-minded and to listen to what that person is saying. Sometimes a person is trying to convey an experience. For example, let's say a person had a good time at a party and they're trying to tell you about it. That is them sharing their experience. And in both these cases, point of view and experience, that can always be submerged in emotion, whether it's good, bad, or neutral. So for example, if you're sitting in class and listening to a lecture, there's a neutral emotion to that. There's not a lot of emotion in that. But if your friend is sitting in your room and he or she is crying and telling you about something bad that's happened to them, they're trying to convey to you that they are feeling negatively. It's a negative emotion. If somebody, for example, is yelling at you, that's also a negative emotion. They're very angry with you. The same applies obviously to positive emotions. Somebody that's telling you a joke or telling you what a good friend you are, that's a good emotion. So always be aware of the emotion that's being conveyed with the words. Remember we spoke about tone of voice? Tone of voice is a good indicator of the emotion that's trying to be conveyed. Then we also have to respond appropriately. When it comes to responding to messages, we need to acknowledge and understand the person. We need to acknowledge to that person that we are understanding them. For example, if somebody's sitting in your room crying and telling you about something bad that's happened to them, a simple sentence such as, "I can see you're going through a tough time," or "I can see that you're very upset," goes a long way in terms of that person feeling understood. Secondly, it's also very important to clarify when you don't understand anything. For example, if your boss gives you instruction, don't be too scared to ask them to clarify that instruction. It's very important that we try and understand exactly what the message is. And lastly, engage. The big thing about communication failure is if somebody chooses not to engage. So it's very important to engage. It's very important for who's ever sending you the message to feel that you are interactively engaging in communication. A good way to foster good communication is to listen empathically. To be empathic means to improve the mutual understanding and trust between two parties. If you listen empathically, it means that the other party feels understood and will start to trust you. It also means paying attention through your body language and verbal feedback. In other words, if you listen empathically, your body language and your verbal feedback will tell that person that you are attentively listening to what him or her are saying. So you may ask, what is the difference between empathy and sympathy? So, for example, if you listen empathically to somebody, a proper response would be, "That must have been so difficult." A sympathetic response would be, "Shame, get better soon." So you can see the difference between empathy and sympathy. Where empathy means that the person feels that they are being understood. If somebody is sharing something very personal with you, and you respond by saying, "That must have been so difficult," imagine what that feels like for the other person, how they feel understood and listened to, versus simply telling that person, shame, get better soon. Let's look at some tips to improve your communication. Tip number 1. When listening, use attentive responses such as yes, I see, tell me more. Secondly, ask questions to clarify and probe. For example, what did you mean by that? In other words, you want to learn more about what the person is telling you. And as we've said before, that's a great way to encourage trust between you and the other person. And thirdly, check your understanding. Never hesitate to ask the person what they mean. For example, you are saying that. In other words, you want to clarify what that person is saying and you want to understand the message that they are conveying. Tip number 4, respond with empathy. Remember, we've already discussed this. Empathy is a great way to foster trust between you and the other person, and it shows the other person that you really care. So for example, you seem worried about what your boss will say. It's a very appropriate empathic response. Tip number 5, check your tone of voice. Are you speaking too softly, and are you speaking clearly? Remember, tone of voice can also convey emotion. So be very aware of your tone of voice. Tip number 6, be confident. Maintain good eye contact and be assertive but not rude. Body posture. Stand upright or sit upright and have an open posture. Sometimes sitting with crossed arms would be considered a closed posture. But if you're sitting with open arms, that means that you're open to receiving what the other person is telling you. So be very alert about your body posture. Tip number 8, be clear and concise. Recognize what the purpose of the communication is. Know what you want to say. Proofread your work and emails and avoid slang. So in other words, be direct with your communication. Don't beat around the bush. Know what you want to say. Also, a good tip is to always proofread your work and emails. Before you send out an email, just go through it again just to see exactly what is the tone of the email and what are you trying to convey. And is the email perhaps too long and cumbersome? And as we said, avoid slang. Obviously, we don't mean when we say avoid slang, when you're in a one-on-one conversation with your friends, obviously we're going to use slang. But in a formal setting, try to avoid slang. Tip number 9, invite feedback. Always be open to feedback. This invites cooperation and communication. Be aware when somebody is giving you constructive criticism versus negative criticism. And when somebody is giving you constructive criticism, be open to that. In other words, a good example is, what do you think about this? This is a good example of you asking somebody or inviting somebody to give you feedback. Tip number 10, be respectful and polite. Don't interrupt. It's very important that when we communicate with others, that we try and be respectful and polite. Obviously, it's not always possible because sometimes discussions can become heated. The problem with that is, as soon as you become angry with somebody or somebody becomes angry with you, they are no longer listening to you, or you are no longer listening to them, and then communication fails. That is why it's so important to be respectful and polite, because it means that you are open to what the other person is saying. If you get annoyed with the other person, that's fine, but as soon as you become angry, there's no more communication that's flowing and communication fails. So as we say, a good example is to not interrupt somebody when they are speaking, because that's a sign of respect and that makes the other person feel that they are being listened to. Anyway, so that's the video on communication. I hope you enjoyed this video and I will see you in the next one.